welcome to Flowcarbon and our ongoing Carbon Smart conversation, which started at our Carbon Smart Summit, which was held during Climate Week NYC in September, and continues now. And our goal with this conversation is to bring together the leaders working to scale the carbon markets, to explore and unpack the most important developments that happen in this rapidly evolving and critically important market for an ever-expanding audience that includes investors and financiers, technologists, project developers, corporate buyers, and many others. A little background about Flowcarbon. So I co-founded our company in 2021 as a carbon finance and technology company committed to propelling the VCM, i.e. the voluntary carbon market, forward through the financing of carbon projects, technical support for carbon projects, and the monetization of credits for carbon project developers. You can learn more about Flowcarbon specifically at flowcarbon.com. But I'd love to move on to our conversation. And to do that, I'm thrilled to be introducing our panelists today. There is literally no group of experts better positioned to convey what just happened at COP than the group that is joining us this morning. So joining us today is Alexia Kelly, who is the Managing Director of Carbon Policy and Markets Initiatives at the High Tide Foundation, and a longtime leading voice in the voluntary carbon markets broadly, and in particular in the ICVCM and the VCMI, two initiatives we'll hear a lot about today. We have Kelly Kazire, who is the Director of Corporate Action and Markets at the Bezos Earth Fund, also a longtime leader in the voluntary carbon markets and a driving force in the ICVCM and the VCMI. We have Mark Kenber, who's the Executive Director of the VCMI, who also holds important roles in the ICVCM and the Science Based Targets Initiative, aka the SBTI. And we have Scarlett Benson, who serves as the critically important Beyond Value Chain Mitigation Lead at the SBTI. So I'm thrilled to have this panel joining us. I'm going to start off by asking a few questions, given that our expert panelists have been described by one of us as a traveling roadshow who are frequently in conversation with one another and are very frequent commentators on these critical issues. I'm going to encourage the free-flowing exchange of ideas between panelists, so please feel free to directly engage with one another as we go along. So with that, I'll dive into questions. So today is supposed to be the final day of COP28, although as many people know, it has not yet really concluded. As of an hour ago, it hadn't concluded. Delegates are working overtime and waiting for the next draft text to arrive. So it remains to be seen how numerous issues end up being resolved at COP28. We do know, nonetheless, that it has been an extremely productive and important COP for the carbon markets. And that's what we're going to focus on here today. We've seen world leaders from the UNFCCC, the World Bank, the U.S. Special Climate Envoy John Kerry, for example, extolling the virtues of carbon markets. We've seen critically important announcements from the VCMI, a new partnership for end-to-end integrity that includes major stakeholders. We've seen 6 CORSIA-approved standards bodies getting together to collaborate and establish consistent standards, for starters. And so, Alexia, I'd love to start with you. You wrote a very compelling LinkedIn post earlier last week on how COP28 has been a watershed moment for carbon finance and markets, how you leave inspired and reinvigorated to continue our work scaling this market. So can you share an inside view of what it was like to be at COP28 as a carbon markets champion and what you saw as the most important outcomes for the carbon markets?
Yeah, absolutely. Dana, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. And as always, a pleasure to be here with my traveling roadshow companions, many of whom I was just with in Dubai. So obviously, I'm just going to do a really quick high-level flyover of kind of the key outcomes, and then Mark and Scarlett and Kelly will be able to add significant additional detail to each of them, because there's a lot to unpack in what was, I would say, an unexpectedly successful set of discussions, particularly around the role of the voluntary carbon market and voluntary corporate climate action, and a broad recognition that we really need markets. They're not optional if we're thinking about how we're going to decarbonize a global economy that is entirely dependent on fossil fuels at the moment, and in which fossil fuels touch every part of doing business. And so the sense that I had really strongly coming out of the first week was we acknowledge and recognize the importance of these markets in really enabling us to start to scale and mobilize climate finance. And I think there was a recognition of a lot of the work that's been done on reform in the market over the course of the last 24 to 36 months. So I think an increasing recognition that these markets are important, that they need to improve, that they will continue to improve, but that they have a really important role to play in helping us deliver what we need to deliver in the next little bit. So some of the largest announcements, and just to note, as you're all aware, the negotiations have not yet concluded. They are ongoing as we speak. We were expecting new text on Article 6 within the last couple of hours. I don't believe it's been released yet. I haven't seen any notification of that. So TBD still on where we land on Article 6, 6.4 and 6.2, 6.4 being the centralized mechanism that the UNFCCC will support administration of, and 6.2 being the set of Paris Agreement provisions that govern bilateral, what we call internationally transferred mitigation outcome transactions between countries. So that set of discussions is obviously enormously important for scaling the Paris compliant carbon market. Still lots of questions about where that's going to land. But in the context of the voluntary carbon market, what we really saw was a recognition of the fact that a lot of the groundwork that's being laid in the voluntary market will play an important role in informing future Paris compliant systems and can help serve as the basis for what is a set of financial markets that are really starting to pay attention to carbon markets and I think recognize the importance of carbon pricing. So we saw new announcements from the Commodities Future Trading Commission. Rustin Benham came and made an announcement. They released their new draft guidance on kind of high quality regulations for what exchange listed and traded commodities are. I'm sure, Dana, you'll have insights into kind of where that landed, but overall, folks seemed very excited about both the substance and the fact that this really important piece of regulation was coming. Similarly, IOSCO's 21 good practice guidance around what they call high integrity financial markets was also enormously important. So the fact that the regulators are stepping in and saying, hey, these markets are here, they're incredibly important, is central. The other piece, and Kelly should talk more about this, but we really saw, I would say, the philanthropic community and parts of the nonprofit community come together in a way that they hadn't before, really coming forward and saying, hey, we think these markets are important. They need to be part of the solution. We need to continue to make sure that they are working and delivering the outcomes that are required for local and indigenous communities. We need to make sure they have appropriate safeguards. We need to, and most importantly, we need to make sure that they're delivering on the environmental integrity outcomes that are so necessary. But that had been really a unified voice that was missing previously and came out loud and clear in this set of negotiations and discussions more broadly. So maybe with that, so that I don't steal all of the thunder, I'll pause there. VCMI came out with an enormous set of super important announcements as well that Mark will talk about. And discussions continue on how this broader ecosystem of voluntary standard setters can continue to work together. So looking forward to the discussion, and thanks so much for the invitation to be here.
Absolutely. I mean, that was a great segue over to Mark. So Mark, thrilled to have you with us. Can you talk about why the recently announced end-to-end integrity partnership, which includes the VCMI, the ICVCM, the SBTI, and some others, is so transformative for the market? Let's start with that before we move over to the VCMI claims code.
So thanks, Dana. Thanks for having me here today. I think what all of us, I think is true to say, all of us would say, we need carbon markets can provide a really effective way of channeling finance to mitigation, particularly in emerging markets and developing countries where it is clearly needed. A lot of the discussions at COP, around COP, have been about financing, be it for loss and damage, for adaptation and resilience, but also for mitigation. But we also know that they only work if they operate under sort of a framework of high integrity. And that means several things. It means, from the supply side, that carbon credits really represent a real and additional emissions reduction or removal. But across the market as a whole, and this is the exam question for all of us, it means that carbon credits should complement and supplement corporate decarbonisation, and as much as possible accelerate and be an incentive for further corporate decarbonisation, not as a substitute for it. And I think so that the exam question that faces all of us is, how do we incentivize a massive uptake and engagement with carbon markets, including voluntary carbon markets, in a way that drives further ambition and further action by corporates themselves? And so what we announced on the 4th of December was that we will work together to collectively answer that question, so that we get more mitigation and more finance more quickly through both carbon markets and corporate decarbonisation driven by initiatives like the Science Based Targets Initiative. And that's the question we need to work on. We at VCMI believe that that is possible, but it'll be possible. It may not be uniform across all sectors and all geographies, and we need to work on that. And we need to make sure that as a result of that, this end-to-end framework, but if you think about the 4 organizations that were on the stage, which was SBTI, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, VCMI, CBCM, that those work together. As we find the answer to that question, that they work together, so corporates are not either confused about what they're supposed to do, but also cannot use some perceived idea of fragmentation or lack of consistency as an excuse not to act. So our work together as we answer that will be, okay, corporates, you now have an end-to-end framework that's high integrity, that builds trust and drives both rapid corporate decarbonisation, which we know we need, which drives, and I'm going to use the phase out of fossil fuels, and drives finance to where it's needed for mitigation across the world. And that's the purpose of the announcement and the purpose of the work that we will be doing through 2024 and beyond.
That's great. The announcement was incredibly well received. I think did reinvigorate everybody who, to use Alexia's word of reinvigoration, I think it was very well received, very well made. Even the video that was put out, I think was a very good video that's intended to reach a wider audience, a corporate audience in particular. So I think this is a huge development. Now, can you talk for a minute about the VCMI claims code, which came out just before COP? And in particular includes a beta of a scope 3 flexibility claim, which as we're thinking about corporates and the key role that they will play in climate mitigation and in carbon markets, I think the scope 3 flexibility claim is a really important unlock for corporates as they think about their supply chains. So can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, happy to. But before we go to the scope 3 flexibility claim, I just want to sort of emphasize that the 2 other parts of the announcement, which are in a way as if not more important, we worked for 1.5 years to develop claims that companies can use, which are above and beyond their progress to meet their science-aligned or science-based targets. And we finalized those to the point that companies now can make a claim. They're called carbon integrity claims. They have a brand, they have a logo associated with them, and there is a monitoring, reporting and assurance framework based on the disclosure requirements, which enables companies now to go through the whole process and make a claim based on the amount of their remaining carbon footprint that they compensate using high integrity carbon credits aligned with the ICVCM's core carbon principles. And those claims, I think the point is now it's no longer a theoretical construct. There are now a set of claims that companies can make. And I just obviously a lot of the noise has been about the beta claim, but these ones are the ones that we have been working for 1.5 years on. And there are companies, and you'll see over the coming weeks and months, there are companies that will be making those claims because they give them confidence that by engaging the voluntary carbon markets, they are showing leadership and not going to be accused of greenwashing. The Scope 3 flexibility claim, which we launched as a beta version because we recognize that there are a number of technical issues still to be worked out, and all my other fellow panelists have been involved in these discussions over the last months, that we need to make sure, there are a number of technical issues about how do we tell whether a company is making real progress to its next target or not. At the moment, there is no objective way of doing that. We did research, both modeling research and surveys of companies, which suggests that a lot of companies are likely to be off track and possibly not meet their Scope 3 targets. And therefore, we published this as a way to start a conversation about, is this a way of getting companies to help them bridge the gap between where they are and where they should be. We published it as a beta so that we can work with organizations, including those on this panel, particularly SBTI, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and ICVCM, to see if and how we can make it work in practice. There is work to be done. We are convinced that there is a role for voluntary carbon markets to play, or high quality carbon credits to play, in bridging that gap. But as I go back to what I said at the very beginning, it's important that that is done in a way that drives more action both across the corporate decarbonisation side and in the voluntary carbon or broader carbon market side. So that's Scope 3, the beta version we've put out there. We've laid out what work needs to be done. We will test it with companies from different sectors. We'll work with our partners across the corporate accountability, target setting, and voluntary carbon market space, and are committed to coming out with a new and improved version, so to speak, in the course of 2024.
Excellent, thank you. And the VCMI has been fairly expeditious with its work, and so we all look forward to seeing what you learn over the course of the beta test, and seeing what you come out with in 2024, hopefully on the earlier side of 2024. Scarlett, I think many of us in the carbon markets were really, really excited and heartened to see SBTI join forces with the VCMI and the ICVCM to provide an end-to-end integrity framework that can more clearly incentivize corporations to invest in carbon projects and take responsibility for their remaining or residual emissions along their decarbonization journey. Can you share from your perspective how you and SBTI view this partnership?
Sure, yeah, and thank you very much for having me. It's always good to be here. So, yeah, maybe just to start clearly by defining what SBTI's role is. So we define and promote what best practice science-based target setting is. And so what we're really focused on is, how much does a company need to deliver in terms of emissions reduction within its value chain over time? And then we have different methodologies for that. There's a kind of absolute approach where any company in any sector, with the exception at this point in time of oil and gas companies, could apply that and commit to and have their target validated. But we also have sectoral methodologies which look at the feasibility of different sectors to abate their emissions over time. And therefore those pathways do reflect essentially the actions that are kind of possible within that sector. So we're really focused on that first part of the journey. Well, clearly the first part is accounting for your greenhouse gases, which is where the Greenhouse Gas Protocol fits into this ecosystem of actors that have committed to align and collaborate and sort of address this perception that there is fragmentation. So we're really focused on the bit about what companies need to do within their value chain. But of course, within the net zero standard that was launched back in 2021, we also included this recommendation on this concept of beyond value chain mitigation, where we encouraged companies to invest beyond their value chains to accelerate global progress to net zero. And there are multiple ways that companies can finance BVCM, including the use of carbon credits. And clearly that is where the interlinkage between VCMI and ICVCM really comes into play. Now, many people always ask me, so, what's the BVCM guidance that the SBTI is publishing next year, and how does that relate to VCMI? And maybe it's helpful to kind of give a little bit of a view on what that guidance will be. And it really is an informative guidance to help companies to understand what the business case for doing this is, for going beyond your science-based targets. What are the sort of suggested steps that you can do to build kind of, internal capacity within the organization, and create that case? And where should companies be thinking about providing finance? We know that there are, very real urgent priorities in terms of mitigation actions, which are severely underfinanced in the short term, where maybe they need finance just to scale, but the solutions are available. But we also know that there's a need for much more innovation and investment into the kind of the technologies that are needed for net zero. So we give a discussion of the sort of goals and principles of what beyond value chain mitigation is. And then we reference, of course, many other guidance on things like the use of carbon credits, how they can be used in the context of BVCM. So I really see the VCMI claims code of practice, the platinum, gold and silver claims, where they are in addition to your science-based targets, as being entirely consistent with what we'd be setting out within the BVCM guidance. And I think, companies can use these two documents in concert to define their strategy. And then, of course, through the VCMI make claims. One of the announcements that we as SBTI made was that we would not be validating BVCM claims. And this is purely given the fact that, there are others stepping into this space, and we want to create a really consistent marketplace where companies aren't confused with different standard setters saying different things. So for that reason, we are providing informative guidance on beyond value chain mitigation, as opposed to moving to validate those claims. So yeah, I guess maybe just to conclude, we're very excited to continue to work with others in the ecosystem. We all play an important role, and we do, of course, recognize the need to give companies that clarity about how they can go to different standard setters at different points across the journey.
Great, that's super helpful. To follow up for a point of clarification, so how does that relate, the BVCM guidance that's coming out, how does it relate to the SBTI call for evidence on the effectiveness of the use of environmental attribute certificates that you recently ran, which includes evidence on the use of carbon credits in corporate claims targets, which closed in November, if I recall correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there are many ways entirely different. So beyond value chain mitigation is really about what companies can do over and above the abatement targets that they've already committed to. It's about additional action. The call for evidence that was released, as many of you are probably aware, there have been numerous kind of technical discussions within, for example, the greenhouse gas protocol on the use of different types of environmental attribute certificates, such as green steel certificates and things like that, in the use of abatement targets. So that call for evidence was really looking to understand what evidence existed on the effectiveness of those mechanisms. And given SBTI will be moving from just focusing on kind of target ambition towards actually also having a focus on the performance of companies against targets, we need to be very clear about kind of which different attribute certificates can be used in different situations by companies to kind of know what counts, essentially. So the call for evidence was, really focused on that. But of course, there was an element of it that was looking at the role of emissions reductions credits. So as a standard setter, this process is really just for us to learn and to listen to a range of stakeholders that have submitted evidence to help inform the development of our standards over time. It's really, a really, what's the word, a kind of a normal stage in a standard setting process that you would have a call for evidence like this. So that's, we closed the consultation, the call for evidence on the 24th of November, I think it was. So as you can imagine, we got a lot of responses and we are going through those at the moment, and we'll be communicating the next steps in the next couple of months.
Next couple of months. Okay, great. We highly anticipate hearing what you've learned through the process.
Yeah, and maybe just to say, everything that's submitted will be made transparently available as well. We're in a kind of processing phase at this point in time, but it will all be made public so that others can see what was submitted.
Excellent. Kelly, you, like Alexia, have played a very, very prominent role as a negotiator in previous COPs. So it would be really enlightening to hear your perspective on how this COP went for carbon markets as a civilian. But in particular, there was a joint statement by 10 leading philanthropies, which was hugely impactful, and I think sent a real signal on the support for high integrity carbon credits and programs by the philanthropic community, which is a community that has real outsized and impactful influence on the VCM. And so I'd love to hear kind of what went into collaborating and making that statement, and what you think its impact will be going forward.
Yeah, thanks. I'd say, yes, I'm very proud of the work that we're doing and supporting in the ICBCM and the VCMI, and in some training related to carbon markets. But I'm actually kind of the new kid when it comes to voluntary carbon markets. I spent most of my career working in compliance markets in the EU. And a lot of what I've learned about voluntary carbon markets come from Mark and Alexia. So I hate to say it, but it's true. They're smiling because they're like, yep, that's true. And in the context, I was in the EU, the lead negotiator on CDM, when we were something like 80% of that market by volume and by value, and really working on how the EU accounting system for carbon markets would work in light of all of the different pieces. And I think that's something that voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets in general have really contributed to the world, is this notion of carbon accounting, in particular book and claim accounting, where you book the reduction or removal in one place and claim it in another. And I think that lesson can be drawn on time and again when we're trying to figure out this complex world of carbon and GHG accounting. Unfortunately, I would have loved to give you an update on where we are in Article 6, but I think that's still ongoing. I've hit refresh a few times during this webinar, and I think those texts still haven't dropped, and I would hate to speculate on where they will land, because as we know, in this process, nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. I can say the points of contention. So before the COP, we had a pretty strong and wholesome recommendation from the supervisory body of the 6-4 mechanism, sort of the centralized, as Alexi said, the new CDM, if you will, the new JI, if you will, under Article 6. And those recommendations are still being considered by parties. I think a lot of the discussion there has been on the role of removals and the role of authorization. We also have a 6.2 text we're expecting, and that discussion, there's been some argument over the definition of cooperative approaches and how broad or narrow that might be, and some disagreement. Some parties want to define that very narrowly, and some parties want it to remain very much a party-driven process where that could be defined quite broadly. So let's see where those land. It may any minute. Of course, this is all right now really caught up in the broader context of the COP and the cover decision, the broad debate about the mention of the phase down, reduction in the use of and reliance on fossil fuels. So I think there's a lot to come in the next hours to see if we can actually drive a successful result out of this COP. So I guess just watch this space. And I'm sorry that maybe we need to start having the post-COP webinars, a week after COP or something, if they keep going hours and hours over. And thanks for asking about the philanthropic statement. I think that was a really important step because obviously, philanthropy has a huge role in supporting these incredible initiatives like SBTI, like VCMI, like ICVCM, in getting this right. So getting the donors, the philanthropic donors, really joined up on this has been an incredible journey, and that has been very much spearheaded by SIF, and I think we're all really grateful to them for spearheading that statement. The statement makes it clear that we're going to need every tool at our disposal to drive climate finance, carbon finance, to reduce and remove carbon, and that high integrity voluntary carbon markets are one of these tools. It also admits that we haven't always gotten it right, that there are VCM credits today that don't meet high enough standards. And to this end, we support the important work underway to improve these markets, including that of ICVCM and VCMI, and the rest of the alphabet soup. And that we recognize as donors the need for stronger coordination and support around these issues, and that we aim to provide a unified approach to philanthropic funding for this kind of carbon finance and for voluntary carbon markets. It was signed by 10 really major philanthropic donors, and I think you're going to go ahead and share it in the chat. So I think it's an important statement to read and a really important step. I also, on the call for evidence, I think, Mark, you spoke to the VCMI, and congratulations on that massive step coming out with the code of practice. But I think you also published or were behind the publication of some of that evidence already at the same time. And Alexa, you guys supported some of that too by Ecosystem Marketplace. Was that published? I don't know. So those are other, just points of context for everything going on in carbon markets. From my perspective, what we're seeing in this sort of corporate climate journey and voluntary carbon markets is just the beginning. We were here 10 years ago when it came to countries and how their targets were defined and how their targets were accounted for and how flexibility worked for them. We need to sort of fast track how that's all going to work for corporates. There's sort of a lack of sophistication in corporate target setting and accounting and what counts and how it counts and all these rules and how this ecosystem fits together. We can draw a lot from how this all worked for countries. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So I think we just, that we need the ecosystem to continue to cooperate and make sure that we fill the gaps and that we resolve any of the confusion and that we get to the point where we have a sophisticated and high integrity set of target setting accounting and flexibility tools available to drive that kind of carbon finance and reduce emissions.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you said a lot. We could take this in a lot of directions, but I do think the last thing you said is particularly important, which is we need to alleviate a lot of the confusion that's plagued the market, both for the demand side, which are oftentimes corporate buyers and the claims that they can make, and the credits that they can buy. And so this is really it all comes back to the essential work that the ICVCM and the VCMI are doing together with partners like the SBTI and everyone who really signed on to the end-to-end integrity initiative. So Alexia, the ICVCM had a huge year, I would say, and had a very busy COP. So can you share an update on the latest and greatest from the ICVCM and the CCP label specifically, and what we can expect soon in 2024?
Yeah, sure thing, Dana. And Mark and Kelly are also deeply involved in the ICVCM alongside. So we basically just spend all of our days together. But the ICVCM did have an enormously important year with more to come. And I think had a huge presence at COP and just across the conversations, really in helping us move forward with full faith and confidence that this market is, in fact, sort of operating at a threshold level of quality, and that we are beginning to move towards more standardized, transparent, and systematically applied approaches to some of these really core and frankly very difficult to implement in kind of the real world practices that we require in the carbon markets. And so the work, and not just the carbon markets, right? Like this is really about how you do rigorous and robust intervention level accounting across the board. And that distinction is quite important because it plays directly into the conversation around how do we do really robust and rigorous in value chain reduction accounting as well, because the fundamental exercise that you undertake is not actually different. And I think that important point is getting lost in this conversation in frankly ways that is fundamentally unhelpful in enabling us to move forward with that really robust and rigorous set of accounting rules that apply universally across mitigation actions, regardless of where they're being implemented. So as the ICVCM moves its work forward, I anticipate that it will increasingly become the basis for how you do robust and rigorous intervention level accounting across a range of applications around the globe. And that work will continue to move us towards more regulated like and systematically applied rule sets. We've had more than, I think, 95% of the existing carbon crediting standards apply now for review under our CCP label requirements, which is very exciting. And so the Secretariat is in the process of going through that evaluation process of those standards. And one of the things that's most exciting to me is that we've seen the full spectrum of standards come forward and apply. So we have, Vera has now announced its application, as has Art Trees, as has Puro.earth, right? So we have the full spectrum of kind of new entrants, incumbent market players, and that's a really important step for the market because it means that we are in fact moving towards that more unified and systematically applied threshold set of requirements. Next year, there's lots more work to do, and maybe Kelly can say a few words because she's really driving a lot of that work about the category working group assessment process and the multi-stakeholder working groups. And just the last thing I'll say is that we also announced continuous improvement work programs that we'll be saying more about very soon. But those continuous improvement work programs are really intended to help bring the full kind of cross-market set of stakeholders together to have a robust and rigorous conversation around how we continuously improve and raise the bar across the market in terms of integration of some of these new and emerging technologies like digital MRV and the things that we know are enabling us to do much better baseline projection and ongoing MRV because we just have better data than we used to have in the market, all the way through to how do we address really fundamental issues like permanence, like Paris alignment, and like social safeguards. So lots of work to come. I think next year will be even busier than last year, which is a terrifying thought. But the entire ICVCM team is fully focused on delivering and moving through our process as quickly as we possibly can, and to delivering outcomes that are really going to enable this market to scale with confidence and high integrity.
Yes, it is all very exciting. Kelly, if you want to pick up the baton and talk about the multi-stakeholder working groups and what is to come in near term 2024 from the ICVCM, that'd be great.
Yeah, instead of going through our whole process, that can be found on the ICVCM website. But what I can say is we're going to have CCP labeled credits available, we will be clear on which credits can be CCP labeled. The actual labeling happens by the standards themselves in Q1 2024. So we are kicking off the multi-stakeholder working groups for the major credit categories in January, and we'll be finalizing those results in Q1. So it will be ongoing. We obviously can't assess all of the methodologies and the entirety of the voluntary carbon market in Q1, but we're going to address a lot of the major categories.
Excellent. I think so there's a lot of substantive work happening, and then there's also a lot of narrative work happening about the VCM. I mean, we all know there's a movement to even stop calling it the voluntary carbon market and call it the verified carbon market. There's just a lot going on that relates to the story of carbon markets and how we talk about the projects that the market supports and the buyers that participate on the other side. Mark, I've heard you allude to an evolving narrative of carbon markets as becoming less about corporate offsetting and more about carbon impact finance for developing countries. Do you want to expand on this shift or this way of framing the work of this market?
Yeah, I think that's right, Dana. And I think there was a good reason for that shift, in as much as, I don't know about the other panelists, but my objective in the work I've been doing for the last 25 years or so is not to create markets for the sake of markets. I want to maximize climate impact by maximizing the amount of finance that goes where it's needed most and maximizing emissions reductions and removals. And I think that's a sort of fairly vanilla and obvious statement to make. But when we focus on the markets, we're focusing on kind of that part of it rather than the impact. And it may boil down to the same thing. What I've noticed in the first week of COP, which I'm very pleased about, was that a lot of the narrative around voluntary carbon markets, and in fact carbon markets more generally, was being driven by the host countries themselves. So it was maybe a shift from something that is about how companies offset or compensate or whatever it is they do with their emissions, to many countries saying we need carbon finance and voluntary carbon markets be part of that for us to meet our NDCs, our nationally determined contributions, and raise ambition in the future. And I think there was a certain sensitivity in some quarters that the integrity narrative was, in a way, let's have lots of integrity as a way of blocking finance or blocking projects. And what was really heartening for me was the number of governments, and I moderated panels with governments from Uruguay to Ghana to Kenya, countries in Malaysia and elsewhere, who all said we need to have high integrity, end-to-end integrity. What ICVCM and VCMI are doing specifically in the voluntary carbon market space, and then the broader end-to-end integrity across all corporate accountability, because that is what will move us from what could be a market that feels like every other tropical soft commodity, where they become commoditized and companies compete on price, and that pushes the price down to the benefit of the consumers in the north, to something that is about how do we leverage additional finance? How do we catalyze that finance? I mean, Kelly's been closely involved in one of those, an energy transition acceleration initiative, and a lot of the point of carbon credits there is the financing they provide, but much more importantly, how they can cover costs that cannot be covered with your commercial investment, how they can leverage additional investment, and therefore how they can play a role in transformational change rather than just project by project change. And I think that evolution, with that being driven a lot by the host countries themselves, recognizing that integrity is the key to unlocking something that's really valuable, has been a really positive development. And I think, and many of those countries have also said, look, we're not trying to get money instead of you companies and the companies from the global north decarbonising. We need both and so that's been a really important part of the narrative as well. And I think something that should, and I certainly hope will, build confidence next year so that we see it scaling up of voluntary carbon markets 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever number we've got to by now, but that is really based on trust, and trust then builds scale, and it drives mitigation across the value chain, not just in one part of it at the expense of another.
Kelly, I see you shaking your head. Do you want to add to
No,
that
I'll
and maybe
just-
talk about, the big news about
Yeah.
the EPA? Yeah.
Well, yeah, so we launched sort of a progress update in the Energy Transition Accelerator, which is a partnership between the Bezos Earth Fund, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the U.S. State Department, specifically the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change, John Kerry. But I think this, what Mark's saying, it just really highlights an issue. It's not, a lot of this has become about this, like, sort of this end-to-end system. We see an issue where we know we need to increase finance by some 700% in terms of energy transition in developing countries. We also see companies really trying to address emissions in their supply chain, in their scope 2 and scope 3, emissions for which they need to be able to count the reductions that they get if they invest in reductions within their supply chain. So I think it's not always about beyond value chain mitigation. Sometimes it's about within value chain mitigation and how that's accounted for. Right now, in terms of those gaps that we see in the system, right now, if companies invest in a decrease in the emissions within their supply chain, they often will not be accounted in terms of the way that inventories are accounted and how we do the supply chain greenhouse gas emissions accounting. And so we're not actually incentivizing the investment that we need to drive. And so a lot of the ETA has been about that, defining, what is the right accounting use case, the sort of insetting use case, something that is allowed by SBTI, but there's not a fully fledged accounting system for in the greenhouse gas protocol. These are these gaps in the ecosystem where we have to be like, okay, so we want to drive finance and we want to be able to count within value chain reductions, but we don't have the right system available for it now. And those are the kind of big problems that we're trying to tackle, and also issues related to, as Mark is saying, this, these ratios that we can get. How much finance can we leverage? If you put this money, if you take revenue and you invest it into something commercial, you can leverage something like 4 to 7 times that amount of finance. So you can really cover something like 50%, 25 to 50% of the capital stack needed for the energy transition through these kind of innovative finance mechanisms. Be they carbon markets, which have a wholesome set of rules related to them already, or a much more advanced set of rules around international RECs, whatever that is, we need to start creating tools, environmental assets to drive this finance. And I think what we're learning is how to complete this ecosystem. And we're all really working together. The problem is we don't have 50 years to do it. We have to do it like now. So these kind of initiatives make us all exhausted.
Yeah, we have to do it now, or last month, or last year, or yes, agreed. So one last question related to that before we move over to the Q&A, because we got lots of fantastic questions coming in. Scarlett, so Kelly touched on insetting as a key driver of finance. Can you talk about how SBTI views insetting, what SBTI's like official position is vis-a-vis insetting?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there isn't really a consistent definition on insetting. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol defines it as where you're using a carbon credit mechanism to quantify for an emission reduction or removal that occurs within your value chain. Whereas there are others that say that insetting is related to, activities that might happen in the landscapes adjacent to your value chain. So that's the first problem, is that there's no consistent definition. Our position is obviously if it's in the value chain, then and you can therefore use it as a way to account in your inventory, then yes, it would count for SBTI. The issue is, and this is maybe making it a bit complicated, but imagine there's a farmer that generates the carbon credit from agroforestry on that farm. And then there's multiple companies sourcing products from that farm. And that one of those companies purchasing from that farm would buy that carbon credit, and they would account for the whole carbon credit. and you get essentially a mismatch because you in inventory accounting, you wouldn't necessarily account for all of those emissions reductions and removals. So it's essentially a problem that we've just been discussing, which is essentially the difference between inventory accounting and intervention accounting, and where they don't overlap and you get inconsistencies, that becomes a problem. So this is just another part of, you know, the stuff that we're looking at in the context of this call for evidence. How are these credits used when you're using intervention accounting for inventory accounting methods, and how should we move forward with that? And this is really complicated stuff, and there are lots of people across our organizations looking at it. So I would say we don't have a clear answer right now. If you can count it in your inventory, you can count it for your science-based target. And that's based on the greenhouse gas protocol, which is what we rely on at this point in time. And for the, you know, and I'm not saying at this point in time because there's any view that we would change that, but just that's what our accounting rules are based on.
How can we get to a clear definition for starters?
On insetting, I mean, my view is I don't actually like the word insetting, but that's my personal view. I think it makes it's quite confusing. We should just talk about instead, how do we use mechanisms to quantify something within a value chain or beyond a value chain? I know that there are some companies that have chosen to remove that language from their narrative because of that lack of consistency. So, but I can definitely say that's my personal opinion and not an SBTI view.
Right. Alexia, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think this is actually the crux of the challenge that we're collectively sort of facing, which is just how do we do accounting for the full range of interventions that are going to be required globally, both within value chain and outside of value chain, in order to address the climate crisis in a robust, transparent, and consistent way. And unfortunately, you know, we should have started actually designing, and did in some ways start designing these rules, you know, 15, 20 years ago. But we have a lot of work to do to actually come to an agreement around, okay, here's the systems and procedures you use to make sure that you are accurately accounting for various interventions, regardless of where they're occurring. And then these are the rules about how those get distributed and allocated. And the thing that really struck me when I was doing work on internal decarbonization and implementation of a science-based target at a Fortune 500 company was that the fundamental accounting exercise that I undertook when I was measuring progress towards my science-based target, for which there is currently no guidance, was not distinct really at all from the accounting exercise that we undertake in the voluntary carbon market when you're trying to measure the impact of a specific set of interventions. So very specifically, I had a whole bunch of diesel trucks I needed to replace or reduce the use of. So I deployed electric vehicles. So the exercise that I undertook to understand the emissions impact of deploying those electric vehicles was exactly the same. And so I hope that we can move as a community into a proper discussion around how you do intervention level accounting in a credible and robust way so that it shows up where we need it to show up, and so that we're getting the incentives right, as Kelly noted. You know, I could do that, and because of how small those emission reductions were, because of the way in which we did our scope 3 accounting, none of those emission reductions naturally showed up in our inventory. And we don't have any guidance right now on how you translate those interventions into your inventory, absent the greenhouse gas protocols project level guidance. So getting to what I hope will be more of a targeted conversation around how we make these systems work and hang together as quickly as possible is going to be incredibly important for unlocking climate progress. Because right now, I still hear every day from companies who are not investing because they don't know what's going to count. So it is incredibly important that we figure this out as a community and provide that clear guidance and guardrails to these companies as quickly as humanly possible, because the climate can't wait.
And which organization do you think is best positioned to offer that guidance, or is it the collective sort of?
It's going to have to be the full ecosystem. We didn't even talk about the advanced and indirect mitigation platform, but Kelly and I are both on the governing board of that. It was launched last year to address exactly this problem. Like, what are the accounting systems, both at a systems level and an intervention level, that are necessary in order to make sure that as you're undertaking various mitigation actions, those are actually translating and showing up in the proper place in your inventory. So we're very excited about that work. It's making enormous progress. It's some of the smartest greenhouse gas accounting brain nerds in the world. And so moving that conversation forward quickly and then figuring out how it plugs into the rest of the ecosystem, whether that's directly into GGP or somewhere else, is still TBD. But the work is happening. We just need to kind of put it all together and make the puzzle pieces fit into a coherent whole as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and it certainly is fundamental to the overall success of the market. So great to hear that the smartest nerds, as you say, are working on it very, very quickly. We're going to move over to Q&A. We got some great questions in, including the first one from a very illustrious audience member, David Antonioli, former CEO of Vera, longtime carbon markets expert and champion, who asks a question that I think probably from Mark, the first answer that you gave, but is kind of fair game for anyone to answer. And it's this: the idea that carbon markets should be complementary to internal decarbonization by companies is not a new idea. And so, Mark, I think you posed an exam question, which is, how are they supposed to work together, these two ideas? And so is it that we need to explain this concept better? Is it that we have not yet come up with a clear answer about how these two things happen at the same time, and so we need to dig deeper? And if it's the latter, what's the time frame and the process for arriving at an answer?
So let me start just going a bit deeper on what I was saying before. We know, as a matter of fact, that there are lots of companies who have targets covering their scopes 1, 2, and 3 that are struggling with their scope 3 targets. And then every year between now and their target dates, they are off track in some sense. But though I said earlier, we don't have a good way of measuring that. And that carbon credits could in some way bridge the gap between where they are and where they should be. The challenge there is when we talk about complementarity, we want to be knowing that the company is making its best efforts to meet its targets, and therefore is using carbon credits in and above and beyond those best efforts. And those best efforts are not necessarily defined by a single straight line or a single squiggly line for a sector, whatever it may look like. So we need to have a better understanding of how those efforts fit together. So that's one point. Second is, in some cases, a company, an Alexia who's worked in companies doing this, they'll have a choice between what to spend their climate money on. And we want to make sure that the way that climate money is spent is a way that, as much as possible, accelerates both decarbonisation and investments through carbon markets. And one way of doing this, if we see higher prices, that higher price can act as an internal price signal to help drive mitigation internally. There may be differences from one sector to another, and there will be cases where not only one sector, but also the types of scope 3 emissions. It's quite hard, for example, for companies to completely eliminate their airline and travel emissions, part of their scope 3, whereas there may be other bits which are more amenable to be reduced, and therefore perhaps use of carbon credits isn't the perfect substitute. So that's what I was saying at the beginning, that there's a big picture, high level exam question, but there are lots of things to dig down into. And Scarlett mentioned the call for evidence that SBTI put out. I imagine one of the things, and I can't speak for SBTI, that they'll be looking at is, where are those differences? Where does it really make sense? And where is it open? And I think there are probably different buckets where, yes, you want to drive companies to invest in carbon credits and other environmental attribute certificates, because that is the best way for them to use their money to drive mitigation. In other cases, the case may not be so clear. So I think, David, I'm sorry, I can't answer a sort of yes/no question. It is about narrative. It's also about real understanding of business decision making, and it's about the interplay between external activities, carbon markets, and internal decarbonisation.
We got a lot of questions about the topic that you just discussed, which is corporations are and really what Alexia said in her last comment, which is corporations are actively trying to figure out basically how to engage in this market, how to make claims that are credible, how to use carbon credits as part of their decarbonization pathway, and maybe as part of their net zero commitments. And so some of the questions that we got include, Mark, one for you, which is, there are companies that were hoping for a sort of on-ramp as part of the VCMI claims code for companies, millions of companies really, that aren't really able to meet the foundational requirements of the VCMI or the SBTI. Is that something that's to come soon?
That is something certainly we're working on. We announced I think in June, when we published the first part of the claims code, that we would be working on that. We are still working on it. We had a huge amount of work to do to get to where we are now with both the carbon integrity claims and the beta version of the Scope 3 flexibility claim. As those who've been involved in the discussions, including pretty much everyone on this panel, know, this is complicated stuff, which has thrown up a lot of gaps in the market. And Alexia's mentioned a few. There's about accounting, and then there's about performance, and Scarlett mentioned that about performance. There are lots of things, kind of tricky issues that we need to work on, not only for VCMI claims, but to have real accountability across corporate action on climate change. So it's not an excuse, it's a reason why we haven't published anything yet, but that is very much part of our work plan for 2024. We have had lots of companies come to us and say, look, we really aspire to make VCMI carbon integrity claims, but we're not there yet, and we'd like something that helps us get onto that journey. And we say, well, of course, it needs to have an entry bar, because you've got to show real intent. And this goes back to the previous question about, how do you demonstrate the accessing or engaging with voluntary carbon markets, or carbon markets more generally, is above and beyond action. So we need something that these companies are doing this seriously as a part of their transition to having full science-aligned targets. And we will be publishing something in 2024. It'll be initially for consultation. It's something that we'll need to work on with colleagues on this panel and elsewhere as well. But it's definitely something we're planning to do.
Okay, great. It is the top of the hour, so I think with that we will have to wrap up, although I think we all could have continued talking about this probably for hours and days. I want to take a minute to really thank our expert panelists for sharing their insights and for being tremendous leaders for this industry. I want to thank all the attendees for joining us, and I want to encourage everyone to join us for our next webinar, which is going to be in February. And if you want to partner with us on this, any upcoming webinars, you can reach out to Jennifer at flowcarbon.com.
Dana, thank you as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Nice to see you all.